Welcome to Glocal Voices, the official podcast of the Center for Socially Engaged Theatre at the University of Regina.
Interesting. I want to switch gear to really speak to the research that we're doing here. And I know when we met in Poland last year, and we started having this conversation. I remember we're going on I'm trying to remember the particular spot now. I think we're going to
Hard Rock Cafe.
The mall. Oh, yes.
It was the Zloty Terasi mall, and it was the Hard Rock Cafe.
Okay.
I know Warsaw.
Okay, sound interesting. And we that when we were kind of conceptualizing this idea, and then after that, now it's become a thing. And can you speak to that, like the development of it, what inspired it, and the process up to now? It's going to a year now where we're at, and it's kind of what's the journey, really.
It has been a journey. It's been a wonderful sort of intellectual arc, I think. So much of my thinking around this was instigated by your research article in Ride Journal. Mm-hmm. And so you, for context, you wrote about it, one of your experiences teaching applied theatre, as I recall. And you specifically mentioned that you were teaching a course to Canadian students.
Theatre history, yeah.
Theatre history. So theatre history to Canadian students, and you wanted to share perspectives from Western Africa, and you encountered a level of discomfort and even anxiety from students. That's a very embodied reaction from them. And many students openly admitted that they felt that if they took the risk of engaging with this knowledge, they might fall prey to accusations of cultural appropriation. You rightly make the argument that that is deeply problematic. It's one thing to be sensitive to cultural appropriation when we talk about commercial giants exploiting marginalized cultures, but this is a different context. This is higher education. This should be a place that is well suited to the kinds of cultural exchange that can push against the status quo. My initial curiosity there was, I was skeptical. I was skeptical about whether these students really were as anxious as they seemed. I wonder whether some of what presented as anxiety was driven by a desire to avoid. I was curious about whether there was perhaps a kind of desire to keep this othered, racialized epistemology at arm's length. To sort of feel that if I'm going to engage theatre history, then I want to engage, the mainstreamed verb, because it's a process. It's something that was done to Western and North American ideas of theatre. It got mainstreamed. I was curious as to whether these students did not want to engage those mainstream histories, and whether there wasn't perhaps some desire to keep this othered history at arm's length. After that, I was thanks to you again, in the privileged position of engaging with some of your interns and masters and PhD students here at CSET. And they highlighted 2 points that I think are worth discussing. One point they highlighted was, is it not possible that some of the anxieties these students articulated, whether genuine or whether as a code for something else, is it not possible that they might have reacted very differently if it was not already part of the status quo to engage a wide spectrum of theatre histories? In other words, if engaging ideas outside North America, from South America, from various parts of Africa, Eastern Europe, parts of Asia, if that had already been normalized, would they have felt that kind of anxiety? Again, is the problem that these students might be accused? Is their vulnerability to accusation the problem? Or are we talking about an institutional problem? The second valuable point they made is that if we are going to talk about cultural appropriation, if we are going to say that, listen, avoiding cultural appropriation in higher education is easy. All you need to do is engage with other materials respectfully. Is that enough? Could we do more? If we could do more, what would that look like? So just as a very brief description, some of them mentioned that what if the engagement with cultural materials you don't associate with, what if instead of just trying to be respectful, we might encourage students to allow that material to unsettle their normative assumptions about the world.
Interesting point. I'm just thinking how to come at this now. Now, I'm going to ask a question around wokeness, because there's a part of that article that I talked about wokeness, and we've talked about that. I'd like you to share that. But before I ask that question, I wanted to just kind of those two things that you've raised, we kind of unpack that a little bit. The first one being about not just the individual student, but as an institution, right? When it comes to curriculum development, realizing that the reality in many North American universities and our curriculum is very Eurocentric. It's in fact, Eurocentric is a broad term. It's really very, very, it's mostly Shakespeare in theater. And so a lot of the materials the students are really engaging with, and I think things are changing, don't get me wrong, but the fact that it's not necessarily mainstreamed, is not part of their curriculum. They're not necessarily engaging with not theater culture, or the Asian theater, the Kabuki theater, the Tiv theater, and you can keep naming them. That some of them don't even know the market theater in South Africa. They don't know many things, right? Because it's not part of the curriculum. So at that point, it's not about the individual. It's very institutional, and because it's institutional, it is very systemic. It has that system perspective that we have to then consider. So the broader question then will be, what do we need to do to change to rethink the curriculum?
Okay. So I mean, again, I have a very specific niche in higher education. So and that might limit what I can say. Take what I say with a grain of salt.
But I also want to say that in addition to what you say, maybe this would also, to add it to one of that project you were talking about, one of your research where you're working with grad, interns or graduate assistant or whatever, because how does that, from their perspective, what can their perspective help us to think about this particular question around the challenge not being necessarily with the individual? Because I do agree, if those students have been engaged with materials, cultural materials that were not necessarily, Shakespeare as a metaphor now, but they were engaged with other kind of materials, then they wouldn't be so much uncomfortable and all that. And so with the curriculum development, the rethinking of curriculum, pedagogy, how we treat those materials, how we teach them, who is teaching them, and all of those things, what would that look like?
Okay, so I guess my answer to that would be that we need to think about ways in which to create a more meaningful space for affect in education. So one of the ways that I work with my learning facilitators to engage students is to create a space where students can bring their own lived experiences into their engagement with whatever the curriculum is centered around. Like, we have a core number of texts that we teach. And we try to create spaces where students can set up a conversation between the theories and the text they're engaging with and their own lived experiences. That is fraught with so many challenges. I'll highlight one that I still don't quite know how to resolve. For example, if we work with students who experience systemic racism, and you work with them in a curriculum to help them understand how to conceptualize racism as systemic and how to mobilize their own lived experiences, one of the initial forms of affect they will experience is just being overwhelmed. Thinking, well, if the problem is systemic, then what are the odds that we can solve this in my lifetime? One has to, on the one hand, respect those lived experiences and bring them in, but at the same time work so carefully with them. What does that mean for the conversation we're having now around cultural appropriation? I think that one of the things that has to be done is that instead of just trying to create a curriculum that is innocent of cultural appropriation, make questions around it central to the way that it is taught. So if a curriculum is going to expose students to a multiplicity of theatre traditions, then involve students and ask them, when do they feel at risk of appropriating cultures they don't associate with, or when do they feel other students might be appropriating cultures they associate with? In other words, there is an obsession, I think, in some forms of higher education that we need to get it right from the beginning, that we must be ethical flawlessly from start to finish. I think that is asking too much of practitioners and students. And I don't mean to make limp apologies for mistakes. What I am trying to say is that I think one of the most meaningful steps we can take is to create a space where students can make mistakes and be open to correction from other students. If you're a student who associates with a dominant culture and you're excited to engage with indigenous theatre, indigenous cultures, or other marginalized cultures, and you make a mistake and you engage with those materials in a way that is potentially disrespectful or appropriating, we should be creating a space where other students can call that out in a respectful way, can critique it, can say, listen man, I'm sure you didn't mean it, but what you're doing now is not okay. And for students to be okay with that, for students to be able to inhabit that uncomfortable space where you grow because you've been called out.
Interesting. And I'll also add, I want to bring the idea of place into this now. You talked about space. I think higher education also is a place where some certain identities are not found, some certain epistemologies are not found, or they are limited. So in the context of the paper that particular paper, I was the only black guy in the. Of course, I was teaching as a sessioner that particular year, and I'm not sure if up to now they have there's any racial diversity in the faculty. So we want to create space, but we also know that space exists in a place. And so higher education, we need to start thinking about how the place as a structure, as a building, as a system, how it needs to become a place where other identities that can actually sponsor that kind of really robust, culturally involving and engaging materials, right? Because I can't just take an indigenous material to say I'm going to go teach it. It will be, the reality is that I might be doing injustice to it and even creating a lot of harm. However, are there other things that we need to think about where we can then make the place where those people, those identities actually feel welcomed? Because then what's the point in teaching curriculum that comes from my culture when really clearly I'm not welcome there?
So I mean, I think one of the wonderful opportunities we have there is that we have access to such a wide range of intellectual resources when we start moving between institutions. I mean, within one institution, there might be limitations without a doubt, but we have opportunities for having professors, researchers, teachers move between universities. If we start thinking of intellectual resources as something that isn't limited in one institution, but when we exchange, we have far more potential. A colleague of mine at the University of the Free State regularly invites scholars from different positionalities and identities. And he asked them to talk about their own intellectual journeys, and that's important because we can't. I don't think we should reduce diversity in the teaching staff to superficial identity politics.
Yes, exactly.
Simply because someone might identify as black and be promoted, become a professor, and we might say, well, cool, let that
We
guy...
have the black.
We've got the black guy. Let him do the diversity.
And then work. Absolutely.
And they might have been. Here's the thing, though. Like what happened in South Africa in some instances is that some of these teaching staff have already been professionalized, which in some cases means they've been indoctrinated into the kind of ideology that they still don't permit affect into the classroom. That's still not enough. We need to create a far more open space. So go deeper than identity politics.
Absolutely. I do agree. I want to move to, and I could go on and on this subject, but we have to be mindful of our time here. I want to go into this conversation about wokeness because that's something that I did write in that article, and I'm happy that we've had this conversation, and I want to go into it with a sense of wanting to know more your perspective, because one of the feedback that I've received is the fact that even using the word wokeness really triggers something, right? Which I do respect and acknowledge, but I like to hear your perspective about that and how that the idea of cultural appropriation you really weaved into wokeness in the context of the article. And it's based on the research we're doing now, we're not even going into wokeness at all. I don't think so, based on the direction. But I just want to hear your thoughts about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
My starting point is that wokeness is a floating signifier.
And what does that mean?
So functionally, that's one of those little lines you can throw out there. Fundamentally, what it means is that wokeness means different things to different people. It is a word like transformation or decolonization or not quite intersectionality, but it is one of those words that becomes a buzzword. And whenever you have a buzzword in academia or in popular culture, there is an almost instantaneous scramble as different stakeholders try to own the word and try to mobilize it. They're trying to leverage it. They're trying to mobilize it to their own ends. So on the one hand, one of the core origins of the word wokeness was simply that it means that if you are racialized as an African American in the United States, then you have to be woke, you have to be awake, which means that you have to be awake to the reality that no matter how you think about yourself, you live in a world where people go black guy, and where forces around you might cluster that identification with pathological meanings like prone to criminality, prone to violence, prone to thuggery, prone to drug use. So the idea was that one must be awake literally in the way that you move, in the way that you carry yourself. Do not be a threat. Do not be a threat to the police. And since then, important things have happened. One is that newer generations, like post-civil rights generations, have become very tired of incremental change. They've wanted to see drastic changes. One of the ways they've tried to reach for this drastic change is through calling out injustice. That's where social media comes in. Me Too and Black Lives Matter. But that's often, again, that gets misconstrued. Now people react by saying, oh, wokeness is the same as cancel culture. Wokeness is about being violent. It's about shutting dissenting voices down. That's not what wokeness is necessarily about. Again, this is the far right trying to turn wokeness into a boogeyman that they can use for political gain. That's my point of departure. Wokeness means different things to different people, and I'm not concerned with trying to define wokeness. I'm not concerned with trying to conceptualize it. My concern is I would rather find out, what does wokeness mean to different people? What are the potential risks and advantages vis-a-vis whatever goal you might want to set? What are the affordances of conceptualizing wokeness as one thing rather than another? So instead of me defining it, I want to see what other people do with it.
In the context of the article, what do you think?
in the context of the article, as you wrote it, like towards the conclusion, you specifically say wokeness is not the problem, which I think is important. Wokeness itself is not the problem. The problem is when concerns about wokeness becomes a way in which students from dominant cultures opt out from engaging with any pedagogical materials that might decentralize them. And I think that is a very important thing to say, because it calls out the way that some identities, whiteness being one of those, insists on a world in which it is normalized and it does not have to be questioned or dissented. So from that perspective, I would say two things. There are two concerns here. If some people are triggered by the word wokeness, it might be an instance of white fragility. Now, I don't know about the personal identifications of all of the people who are triggered by it. It's probably more complex, but I would say that's one line of analysis I would undertake at the beginning. Is someone being triggered by wokeness, by the word, not an instance of white fragility? And what I mean there is talking about instances in which people who are racialized as white and privileged by it feel so uncomfortable with talking about race relations that any mention of it at all becomes unbearable. That is not something that is constructive in higher education. A second problem is what has sometimes been called white wokeness. And that's a very specific, I'm not saying that white people can't be woke. It's a very specific concept. And what it means is that there is a problem when those who are privileged by whiteness engage in short-term commitment to racial justice. For example, I've attended one Black Lives Matter rally. Good on me, I've done it. I've signed a petition. That's the end of it. I've done my bit. I don't need to continue into a lifelong journey reflecting upon how society categorizes me and privileges me.
Interesting. So what's next in the journey of this research that we're doing? Do you want to speak to that?
So we've got two exciting projects going on. One is the compilation of a book of chapters in which we have invited a number of scholars from a variety of fields and traditions of thought and a wide spectrum of identifications to contribute their thoughts. We don't want this to be an instance in which, stimulating though it is for us to have these conversations, we want to broaden the conversation. So we are working on editing a book of chapters that should be fascinating. Some of the abstracts already look amazing. Yep. And the other thing is that we're also thinking about ways in which we could create a theoretical perspective that can offer some guidance to people in higher education. How to think about questions around epistemology, ontology, reflection and praxis when you're confronted with questions around cultural appropriation.
Fascinating. Well, we've been talking with Dr. Marthinus Conradie for over an hour or more. Do you have any question for me before we wrap this up today?
So I guess my question to you would be like a two-part question. One would be, what do you find, what are you most excited about in our current research project and the book, and around where we might take that theoretical framework? What is most important to you? Mm-hmm. And secondly, how are you thinking about CSET's contribution in terms of social justice, whether that's along racial lines or more intersectional lines? I'm curious about what stands out to you as the most fruitful future steps for the Center for Socially Engaged Theatre.
Let's start with the first question. I think I'm really super excited that that article really started all of this. Thanks to Yasmin Kandel, because she was one of the co-editors for that special issue. And I'm like, I'm just gonna throw this in, and see what it's bearing, which is really great. I really appreciate that. But I think for me, what's exciting though, it's one to decenter me from that, because I did write it, and I'm grateful for that. And thanks to God for that revelation and that wisdom and all of that. But I want to decenter me, because it's really interesting that when that article came out and people read it, I got a lot of emails saying, this is what I'm experiencing in my class. This is what I'm experiencing trying to put a theater piece together, like from the UK, here in Canada, different spaces. So I'm like, I think there's something here that is not just about me. It was just that I was just the channel to articulate that experience, which means that if there are multiple, there are similar experiences like that, I'd love to hear it. I love to hear it, and that's why I'm really excited that having you, for example, from South Africa, with your own experience, first your background in critical race theory, and your own experience in a different countries that has its own history and histories within the continent, and your collaboration and all of that. That ways that we can then bring in multiple perspectives to this kind of idea. I think for me that's what really fascinates, but one of the things that's really fascinating for me, that this idea is just like a seed, and it's just kind of moving away from, it's going beyond me. And so I'm really hoping that the book collection, like this kind of podcast conversation, because I think this is the second one we're having now, and later on we're talking about even finding a way to write something in open access, like the conversation and other places like that, that this can help really find a way to really let hear other people's perspective. So that for me, that's the first thing I'm really excited about. The second thing I'm really excited about is it's a bit of that, is that I think that there is a sense of hope that I'm hearing. And what I mean by that is that when people are asking themselves these questions, they are reflecting and they're saying, hey, I don't know, I just want to do it right, and all of that. I think that we're on this cusp of something here, that we now know that good intentions are not enough, that we want to ensure that we do it appropriately, that even when we make mistakes, we can still be bold enough and still be humble, be courageous enough and be humble at the same time to say, I made a mistake here and I'm really sorry. And what can I do differently? Because when we find ourselves, this is what I call intellectual humility. And we need to have epistemological and ontological humility. The moment we don't have that, there's going to be a problem. I was speaking at a class when I was in London in June, and I was saying this exact same thing, that I think that in higher education, we've created spaces and places where it seems mistakes are not allowed.
Yeah.
And the moment mistakes are made, we penalize. We penalize students for making mistakes. We penalize students, even faculty members. We penalize, like all of us are penalized for so many things. Now, don't get me wrong. I am not saying that mistakes don't happen. I'm not saying that people are not, people are people and all of that. But I think that the same way we need to have what we call intellectual curiosity is also the same way we need to have epistemological, ontological, intellectual humility. And I think for me, that's what I also find really exciting in this kind of research, that can help us to know that we need to all agree that we don't know everything. We need to agree that our methodologies are fraught. Whether you're doing CPPR, community-based participatory research method, whether it's PAR, whether it's mixed method, whether it's qualitative, it's quantitative, whatever method or methodologies that you are using, all of them, it's not perfect.
Yeah.
It's not perfect. Right. I'm not going to tell you my own culture, everything in my own culture is fine. Everything in my culture is 100% great. Everything in his indigenous culture is beautiful, is great. Everything in Western, no. When we get to that point, for me, and this is my opinion, we're losing something if we think that we have it all right all the time. No. And that's where want us to. I'm really excited that, and again, this is my own provocation, right? It's my own thinking that there's something that this can help us to really think about the system in which we've constructed, the place and the spaces that we've constructed, that it is lopsided, it is fraught. Therefore, we need to constantly ask ourselves questions over and over and over, so that we can constantly do that system check. We're constantly doing that process check. We're doing that character check. Because at the end of the day, if what we're doing doesn't transform us first, ourselves, then I'm not sure how it's going to transform the society. I'm very sorry. It's again, this is my opinion, my very own opinion, and I stand behind it because it's my opinion. That we have to get to that place where, as much as we celebrate intellectual curiosity, we also celebrate intellectual humility. We celebrate and really recognize epistemological, ontological, and feel it, but end it with humility. And I think for me that becomes very critical, and that's my own really thinking around that. And then the last thing I'll say, it's really my excitement, and again, this is my own vision and my hope, that this can then spark a lot of rethinking when it comes to curriculum development. It can spark a lot of thinking when it comes to materials and the people that are teaching those materials. It can help us to think about the bodies that are represented in the spaces and the places that we've created in higher education, because those things are very important. And again, this is what critical race theory can, for me, in my opinion, really help us to think, give us some tools to think about. And we also see the flaws in critical race theory itself, right? And all of that. So for me, that's the hope. That's the part of what makes the excitement for me, is that, again, and hopefully somebody will pick this up whatever we can do. Somebody else will pick it up and move forward with it, right? And then to go to your second question in terms of where I see CSET, I may not speak to CSET more broadly. I can speak first for myself. I'm really grateful again that CSET is an entity on its own. Of course, it's my brainchild, and really grateful for that opportunity. But I'm hoping, but it's also shaping up to what it's gonna be, because we're bringing intellectuals like you and a lot of, we've had this year alone, we had 2, GRIs from Europe. We have brought in so many. I continue to work with different people. We have researchers that is working on in-flight entertainment, and aviation, and researcher that is interested in performing allyship and then policing and activism, emotional intelligence. We have a lot of partners who are industry partners. We have a lot of research, doing a lot of research when it comes to future studies and all that. Now, all of these research are coming out of my portfolio, obviously. But you see, what that does is that it helps create a space and a place to shape this broad-minded thinking. And I think for me, that's something that CSET can then contribute as we move forward, which then speaks to me, where I can then speak more to myself, of course, beyond, in terms of space to do research and the little, resources that we have here and there, and all of that. But really for me personally, as a researcher, as a father, in my own faith journey, in my own relationship as a supervisor, as a mentor, and all of those things, I think for me, it's that multi-layer perspectives that I'm constantly. It's a privilege too. I've marveled at that, but I'm also thinking that also helped me to bring that humility into the conversation, to say, well, this is really exciting, but how can, when we look at it from the perspective of a supervisor, it's different. When we look at it from the perspective of a pedagogue, it's different. When we look at the perspective of a researcher, depending on the methodology you're using, who you're working with, the time you're doing it, how you're doing it, where you're doing it, and all of those variables that are constantly shifting and changing, it's a different perspective. So for me, I'm truly hoping that all these perspectives that, and way much more that others are able to bring into that it can shape that direction, that we can then say, we're only channels, to be honest. We can say, this is it, I remember a few days ago, we're talking about the conceptualization and that framework and all. I'm like, this framework has a lot of potential, for example, to be able to help us think about, cultural appropriation for a director in theater who has a material to direct and is the only one that can direct the show in the department, and there's nobody else that can direct it. And you don't have funding to go and hire a director, to come. So what are you gonna do, right? And that's the material you want to work with, or your student chose to work with that material and all that. What are you gonna? Or you're working in a community and you're an outsider. You're not an insider. You're working with gatekeepers. And we have so many cases, right, where the reality is that this is their reality. And I'm hoping that things like that can really help create a robust way to think, in addition to their robust experience and thinking.
Well said.
Well, thank you so much. Well, it's on that note that we will bring this edition of Glocal Voices to a close. Thank you to, again, Dr. Marthinus Conradie, who spent almost a month here, really engaging with us on this research. Also, we had a reading group that were part of the course that I taught earlier on in the summer, and then he had great time with them, really speaking to some of our students, counseling them. Counseling should be the right word. Advising them, collaborating with them. There's some of them that you spoke to them about their research methodologies and sharing your experience and expertise with them. So thank you, Chief, for taking that trip all the way. I remember last year when I was in, Bloemfontein, I'm like, my goodness, it's a faraway place. And so thank you for taking the time to come here. And thanks to all our students and all the works that everybody is doing at the center, and to all our partners, thank you. And thanks to Gabriel for taking the time to do this. And I'm gonna plug something here for him. He's really expertise in production, editing, possibly I want to have a career in it. But to say that, I think that for me, this is part of what opportunity like this, that when you really creating place and space like this, where the extracurricular, the extra, what we don't consider as really, these are skill sets that any time, any day becomes very critical. So just doing that plug-in for Gabriel. And then to all the research students and my RAs at the center, really thank you for all that you're doing. And to all our partners and funders, the funders of the Canada Research, my Canada Research and Social Engaged Theatre, the SHOC, and of course CFI, and the University of Regina, and the Faculty of Media and Art Performance. And to all our partners, thank you. And once again, it's Taiwo Afolabi signing out. We'll see you in our next episode of Glocal Voices.
You have been listening to Glocal Voices, the official podcast of the Center for Socially Engaged Theatre at the University of Regina. For more details about the center, visit www.cset.ca.